examining the financial crash of 2007. Please help me welcome Chris Fox with a speech entitled The Bubble.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody's familiar with what happened in 2007, the financial crash that devastated our economic landscape. But a lot of people aren't sure exactly what happened or why. And during that time period, many of you probably heard about the housing bubble, or the bubble. And you may wonder what that was referring to. It was talking about home prices that just kept going up and up and up and up. And everybody wondered at the time, how is it possible that they just keep rising? Is there ever going to be an end? And for years, the pundits said no, they're just going to keep going up. But as we all know, in 2007, those housing prices crashed, and when they did, it took our economy with it. So how did they inflate so highly? What caused it to happen? And how could we have prevented it? And those are the questions that I'm going to answer this evening. And it all comes back to the banks, because ultimately it was the banks that were driving the frenzy of both refinance and purchases that caused this whole mess to occur. And this began in 1999 when a law called the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. Those of you who saw my previous speech on the matter may remember that this law prevented banks from doing anything other than being a bank. When the law was in effect, banks could take in deposits and they could make loans. But they were very careful about who they made loans to, because if that loan defaulted, then the bank lost the money. As soon as Glass-Steagall was repealed, that whole business model changed. And you're going to see how dangerous that is, because it removed accountability from the banks. Once that law was gone, the banks now had incentive and the means to sell loans directly on Wall Street. And they did so using something called a mortgage-backed security. So security is a type of stock, and it's backed by a mortgage, hence the name mortgage-backed security. So what the bank would do is they would take, let's say, $30 million in loans, and they would bring this offering to Wall Street, and then they would sell shares, just like you would any other stock in any other company. So I could buy $10,000 worth of this mortgage pool, and when the people that were in that pool made their payments every month, I would actually get paid the principal and interest. The ratings agencies gave these a AAA rating, which means that they were the highest gold standard of investments. They were so safe that it was almost impossible for anything to go wrong. So they're paying a high yield to get a lot of interest from them, and they're an ultra-safe bet. As you can imagine, Wall Street was thrilled. They loved them. And all of a sudden, every bank in America was selling these mortgage-backed securities onto Wall Street. And this really hit a frenzy around 2001 or so. And banks were making a killing doing it, because instead of having to sit on a loan for 30 years before they could get paid all their interest, they could just go offer it on Wall Street and get paid right away. So banks were thrilled. But unfortunately, because they were no longer directly accountable, because they didn't have to watch that loan for the next 30 years, they didn't care whether or not the borrowers could repay it. They're just going to sell it on Wall Street. If it blows up a few months later, oh well. And this is where you started to see the first of the fraud. And it started innocuously enough. Things like slightly inflated appraisal values, or turning a blind eye when someone was filling out their documentation for a loan. But it wasn't really bad in the beginning. They were still doing 15 and 30-year fixed loans, and they were giving them to borrowers who had good credit, so it wasn't too bad. But as time went on, more and more borrowers that could afford a house got one. And they started running out of borrowers. So this began the interest rate war in about 2002, and it lasted until about 2005, causing what we call the refi war. Because every year, let's say you had a 7% interest, and a year later, now you can get a 6% interest, that's going to save you $300 a month. So everybody in their right mind is going to want to refi. And then a year after that, you could get it down to 5%. So you could save another $250 a month. So everybody was behind that. So for about 3 years there, every homeowner in the United States was refinancing their mortgage because they were saving great money doing it. And the banks were thrilled because they would take these refinances and sell them as mortgage-backed securities on Wall Street. Everything seemed like it was going great. But then they started running into a huge problem. Interest rates bottomed out around 4%. And anything lower than that, the banks weren't going to make a profit. So they couldn't keep pushing them down because it made no financial sense to do so. So now they've tapped all of the people who can buy a new property, and they've tapped all the people who can refinance their homes. The banks were panicked because their next quarter profits were on the line. What do? They've got to find some new source of borrowers. And this is where the fraud really began to accelerate. Because the banks decided, you know what? We don't really want to know the truth. We'll fund a loan for anybody as long as we can sell it on Wall Street. And what they did to facilitate this, they created a program called Stated, which is also known as the liar's loan. You state your income and you state your assets, and then the bank doesn't check it. So I say I work at Carl's Jr. flipping burgers, and I make $12,000 a month, and I have $50,000 in the bank. And Countrywide, or whatever other bank you were doing your loan with, is all great. We'll take your word for it. Stamped, it's funded. And they would do up to 100% financing. So you didn't have to have any skin in the game at all because the bank wanted this loan made at any cost. It was profit for them. And they knew that once this loan was funded and actually sold on Wall Street, a few months later it was going to blow up. But they didn't care because, again, they're no longer accountable. They don't have to keep this loan. Now, unfortunately, stated was not enough because, as blatant as that is, you still couldn't find enough borrowers. So they started coming up with exotic arms, loans that were a lot more creative. The first of them was the 228, which meant it was fixed for 2 years and adjustable for 28. So if you got a borrower into this home, and they've got a 580 FICO score, which means they never pay anything, ever, they would start out with maybe $1,700 as their payment. And they'd be, eking along, managing to make that payment, but at the end of 2 years, it would jump to $2,600 a month. And all of a sudden, these people can't make their payment. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I suddenly had to come up with another $900 a month for my house payment, I'd be in deep crowd. It would not go over well. And millions of Americans were running into this. But despite the fact that it was occurring, the media turned a blind eye to it. They didn't warn people. They didn't say anything about it. In fact, quite the opposite. They were encouraging you to get these loans. And as time went on, the banks got more and more aggressive about just how bad of a loan they were willing to give someone. So the next one they created was called a neg-am loan. It stands for negative amortization, which in English means you're not even paying all the interest on your loan. So if you have a $1,200 a month payment, then your interest is probably closer to $1,500. So when you pay $1,200, it pays part of the interest, and the rest of it gets tacked onto the principal balance of your loan. So instead of your loan going down like it's supposed to, it goes up. Now, anybody who takes a logical look at a loan like that, or a 228, is going to realize there's no way this loan is going to make it 30 years. The borrowers are going to default within 3 or 4 years. And by 2005, these were the two loans that were being funded more than any other, the 228 for subprime borrowers, and the payment option arm, or neg-am loan, for A-paper borrowers. So I worked in the mortgage industry at this time. This is how I knew to get out. I saw the writing on the wall, because it's unsustainable. And at the same time, because people were constantly refining and selling properties, and because appraisers were so willing to commit fraud for a little extra money, housing prices, especially in California, had doubled during that same time period. So even if you made like $80,000 a year, and your spouse made like $80,000 a year, you could not afford to buy a house by 2006 in California. It just wasn't possible. Maybe a little shack somewhere for $400,000, but real estate prices were so insane that no one could afford them. And this is what caused the housing market to crash. Once the bubble hit that upper end limit where no one could get loans anymore and values were not continuing to increase, all sales stopped. The whole machine kind of ground to a halt. These mortgage-backed securities were still being sold, but all the smart, savvy investors, realizing that they were bad investments, had stopped buying them. So the question then is, who was? And this is the part that's probably going to upset you. You were. How many people in the room had a 401k during the years between 2006 and 2009? Okay, I'd say about half the room. Of those people, put your hand back up if it lost money. All of exactly the same people. Every single hand came up. And the reason for that is that your 401k was run by a hedge fund manager in what's called a mutual fund. It's a basket of investments that they pick out that they think is going to make you a profit. And what they were told by the ratings companies, who were in collusion with the banks, is these are the safest investment you can possibly have, and they pay a great interest rate. So of course your hedge fund manager is, oh, these are wonderful. Let's put all these people's retirement dollars, the whole American public, into mortgage-backed securities. The banks, meanwhile, have pulled back, and to add insult to injury, they created something called a credit default swap, which is effectively a bet. And the bet was that they knew all these subprime loans were going to blow up and that your 401k was going to lose money. And when that happened, not only did they get paid for selling you the crappy loans to begin with, they also got paid again on this bet that they had created. Because, of course they were right, the loans blew up. They made them, they knew they were fraud. So when all of these loans self-destructed, the banks are walking away with a big pile of money, and the rest of us are trying to figure out how we're going to retire in the next 5 or 10 years. This was in 2007. In the 5 years since, do you know how many people have been prosecuted for this? None. Not a single person. It's not even brought up anymore. And the banks can still do all of the exact same things that they were doing back then. No prosecution, no accountability. And the sad thing is, we could fix the entire situation by just reinstating one law, the Glass-Steagall Act. It would force banks to do just what they did from the Great Depression until 1999. And that's make loans, make them with an eye for accountability to people that they want to pay them back, and not sell them on Wall Street. There'd be no more bailouts necessary because banks would be fiscally responsible just like they used to be. So ladies and gentlemen, I am hoping that you leave tonight a little bit more angry than when you came in, and that you remember the words Glass-Steagall, because if we're going to come out of this as a nation, we need that law back. Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Toastmaster.